They ordered her away from the Vreth. The cubs had not been consulted. A story from the Predator Cubs and Beasts Night. By author. I want to be clear about something before I tell this story. I am not a soldier. I am not a trained handler. I have never in my life held a weapon more sophisticated than a soil coring drill. And the closest I have come to apex predator fieldwork is 3 seasons of mapping the root depth profiles of frost thorns and shrubs on the outer ridges. Calvin Colony, which is, I assure you, about as heroic as it sounds. My name is Marinos. I am 43 years old. I have flat feet, a permanent callus on my right index finger, from a stylus I have been using for 12 years, and a mild allergy to a class of synthetic protein that shows up in approximately 40% of refugee ration packs. These are the facts of me. I am telling you this because when people hear what happened aboard the Vreth crossing, the transit vessel that carried 912 displaced colonists from the Calvin-Evac corridor to the outer threshold processing stations, they tend to imagine someone more impressive than I am. I was not more impressive than I am. The Vreth Cubs simply chose me anyway. The Vreth crossing was a cargo hauler converted in a hurry, the way everything in those years was converted in a hurry. She was 700 meters of dull gray hull plate, 3 functioning waste reclamation lines out of a possible 5, and passenger decks that had been carved out of former refrigerated storage holds by the simple expedient of removing the cooling racks and bolting down rows of cot frames in their place. The ventilation smelled of old coolant and synthetic fabric. The lighting ran in 2 modes, too bright and slightly too blue, or dim amber emergency glow, with no comfortable middle ground. The corridors were narrow enough that 2 adults had to angle their shoulders to pass each other without touching. I had been assigned to hold 7, Deck C, which held approximately 140 colonists, a mountain of secured baggage, 3 malfunctioning overhead fans, and, in the far rear port corner, behind a temporary wire enclosure that had been assembled by a ship's hand who very clearly had no idea what he building 2 juvenile Vreth. I did not know what Vreth were when I first saw them. I knew the word. Every colonist in the outer systems knew the word the way. They knew words like pressure, drop, or emergency seal. Something you encountered in safety briefings. Something you were told to take seriously. Something that lived in the back of the mind as a sharp, categorical fact. The Vreth were a pack predator species from the spinward fringe. Adults ran roughly to human shoulder height at the withers, which sounds manageable until you realize that they did not stand like dogs. They stood like something that had been designed, great deliberateness, to make every other creature in its vicinity acutely aware of the distance between its teeth and whatever it was looking at. They were covered in short, dense fur that ran from black at the spine to deep gray at the flanks, with a lighter, almost silver underside. Their skulls were broad and flat-browed, their muzzles long and equipped with more teeth than anything in the known catalog of domesticated fauna. They communicated in a register that included sounds a human larynx could not produce, and vibrations that a human ear could not fully hear, but which the human body feel. A low, sub-bass pulse that moved through the deck plating and settled somewhere in the chest cavity. Not quite a sound and not quite a sensation, but something that made the fine hair on your forearms stand at attention. Vreth adults were, in short, not an animal you wanted to share a converted cargo hold with. The cubs were different, not safe. I want to be clear about that. They were never safe. They were the offspring of an apex predator species that had, at full maturity, earned the reputation of being the only thing on the spinward fringe capable of hunting the Keth. And the Keth were what the fringe systems called themesome category concern, which was the bureaucratic way of saying something that made experienced soldiers breathe a little faster when they heard the name. The Vreth cubs were not domesticated. They were not tame. They were not small. They were juveniles, perhaps 8 or 9 months into what would be a 3-year maturation window, and they were already the size of a large sheepdog, all angular limbs and outsized paws and ears that had not yet grown fully into their promise of eventual enormity. But they were also, when I first saw them, pressed together in the corner of their wire enclosure, with their chins on the floor and their eyes tracking every person who walked past with an expression that I can only describe, having since had time to understand it better, as a very specific kind of vigilance. Not aggression, not fear. Something more controlled than either. The watchfulness of a creature that is not in danger but is running a continuous assessment of whether that might change. Their handler was a man named Das Peller, a young Vreth licensed keeper from a fringe station who had been evacuated alongside his charges, because the alternative was leaving them to the thing that had made the evacuation necessary in the first place. He was 26 years old and looked about 19. He had dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch since the evac began, and he moved around the wire enclosure with the particular combination of competence and exhaustion that marks someone who is doing a job well under conditions that are genuinely terrible. I noticed him because he was, that first day, the most anxious person in Hold 7, who was not crying. I noticed the cubs because, on that first night, they would not stop making the chest pulse. I should explain the chest pulse, because it matters. The Vreth communicate distress in a register that human ears read as silence. You don't hear it as a sound. You feel it as a pressure, a rhythmic, low-frequency vibration that transmits through any solid surface the animal is in contact with and radiates outward through the floor, the walls, the frame of every cot bolted to the same deck. It is not painful. It is not, in any clinical sense, harmful. It is, however, absolutely impossible to sleep through, because whatever part of the human nervous system inherited the task of monitoring the environment for threats that cannot be fully seen or heard responds to it with a persistent, low-grade alertness that will not quiet itself regardless of how many times the rational brain reassures it that the vibrations in is merely two juvenile predators expressing discomfort in a converted refrigeration hold. In a hold full of grieving colonists who were already sleeping badly, the effect was cumulative in the way that most bad things are cumulative. Not a crisis at first, just a steady addition to an existing weight. First night, people shifted in their cots and did not know why. The second night, 3 people in the cots nearest the enclosure moved themselves to the aisle, dragging their mattresses, because the vibration was weakest there. By the third night, there was a secondary ring of mattresses in the aisle, and a primary ring of exhausted, red-eyed colonists, and the hold smelled of 3 days of poorly slept anxiety in a way that had begun to compound itself. I was among them. I had not slept more than 2 hours, at a stretch, since we left the Calvin corridor, not only because of the chest pulse, though that was part of it, because grief does not resolve itself into sleep easily, and I had a great deal of grief and nowhere particular to put it. I had spent the first night of the transit lying on my cot in the amber dimness, counting the structural bolts in the overhead panel and thinking about the survey data I had left behind, 12 seasons of rooted field notes on a server array that was now, in all probability, slag. I had spent the second night reading the fauna regulation on my personal reader, because at least that was doing something, even if what it was doing was reading a regulation. The third night, I was reading the source citations behind the regulation, when the chest pulse shifted register. Not louder, not stronger, different. Something in the rhythm of it changed in a way I could not have described precisely, only that the part of me that had spent 12 years learning to read environmental signals noticed the change the way you notice a shift in wind, direction on an open hillside. Not consciously at first, just as a fact that arrives before you have decided what to do with it. Down my reader, I sat up and looked at the enclosure. By the second night, Hold 7 had a problem. Commissar Vreth O'Doon, the ship's senior security officer, a compact, precise man with the kind of posture that communicates, at all times and in all circumstances, that he considers the situation around him to be marginally below the standard it should meet, arrived at Hold entrance on the morning of the third day with 2 security hands behind him and an expression that had clearly been rehearsed in front of a mirror until it carried exactly the weight of authority he wanted it to carry. He informed Das Peller that the Vreth were disturbing the passenger population, that the welfare assessment protocol for displaced fauna aboard civilian transit vessels allowed for relocation to cargo isolation under specified distress indicator conditions. That the chest pulse frequency logged over the previous 48 hours met the distress threshold outlined in paragraph 7 of the relevant regulation, and that he, Commissar O'Doon, was exercising his authority under that protocol to have the animals moved. Dos Peller, who was 26 and exhausted and clearly not someone who had ever been trained to argue with a man like Commissar O'Doon, went a very particular shade of pale. I had been sitting on my cot, which was 12 cots down from the Vreth enclosure near the middle of the hold, close enough to the ventilation fan that the noise gave me something to focus on when the chest pulse was particularly insistent. Eating a protein ration that contained, I had confirmed, none of the synthetic varieties I was allergic to. I had been watching the exchange since Odin walked in. My ration down. I want to be clear even now, though, that I did not have a plan. I am not a person who has plans in situations like that. I am a person who has, after 43 years, developed a fairly functional relationship with the part of myself that notices when something is going wrong and would like, on balance, to try to prevent it. That part of me stood up, walked the 12 cots down the hold, and inserted itself into the conversation before the rational part of me had fully agreed to let it. "Commissar," I said. Odin turned. He looked at me the way very certain men look at unrequested interruptions, briefly, assessing, then dismissive before the assessment was complete. "This is a security matter," he said. "I understand that," I said. I was wondering if I could raise a practical point. He waited, in the specific way of a man who has decided to let the interruption conclude so he can return to what he was doing. "If the animals are moved to cargo isolation," I said, "the distress pulse will continue, probably intensify. Juvenile Vreth in unfamiliar isolated confinement without their bonded handler would have elevated distress indicators, not reduced ones. Which means the source of the disruption you're trying to address will still be present, just move to a location where the handler can't work with it. And the protocol you cited, paragraph 7, includes a provision that isolation is not indicated when a licensed keeper is available. And remediation hasn't been attempted." Mr. O'Doon looked at me for a long moment. "Are you a Vreth specialist?" he said. "No," I said. "I'm a soil surveyor. But I read the regulation last night when I couldn't sleep." There was a pause. "Remediation," O'Doon said, with the emphasis of a man tasting a word he finds unsatisfying, "has not produced results in 48 hours. Mediation by one exhausted handler in a high-traffic hold with 140 anxious civilians walking past the enclosure every hour." I said, "I'd like to try something different if you'll give it 24 hours. I do not know to this day why Commissar O'Doon agreed. Perhaps it was the paragraph 7 argument, which was sound. Perhaps it was the calculation that 24 hours of civilian initiative mediation was a cheaper cost than the paperwork that came with the disputed fauna relocation. Perhaps he simply wanted to be done with the conversation. 24 hours, he said. "If the distress indicators are not below threshold by 0600 tomorrow, the animals go to isolation." "That is not a negotiation." He left. Peller looked at me. "What," he said, "are you planning to do?" "I don't know yet," I said. "Can I sit near them?" What I knew about the Vreth. What I had read. In the hour between 3 and 4 in the morning, when the chest pulse had gotten bad enough that I'd given up on sleep and read the fauna transit regulation cover to cover, and then followed the citations into the source material, was this: juveniles, when separated from their adult pack, orient their distress response toward the nearest consistent stable presence. In the wild, this would be a senior pack member, an adult Vreth, whose scent, sound profile, and physical stillness functioned as an anchor signal, something the body of a juvenile could lock onto and use as evidence that the environment, however strange, contained something that was not panicking. In the absence of an adult pack member, this function could, under sufficient conditions, be fulfilled by a different species. The key word was stillness. Vreth did not. The source material was emphatic on this point. Orient toward strength. They did not orient toward dominance signals or territorial displays, or any of the things that worked on smaller, simpler pack animals. They oriented toward calm, toward the creature in any given environment whose nervous system was producing the lowest alarm signature. The creature, that was most thoroughly and genuinely not afraid. The problem in Hold 7 was not the cubs. Problem was that Hold 7 contained 140 displaced colonists who had, 3 days ago, watched their homes become uninhabitable and who were now crossing a large section of difficult space in a converted refrigeration unit, and who were, understandably, reasonably, entirely justifiably, afraid. The hold was saturated with alarm signatures. It smelled of fear and sour adrenaline and barely suppressed grief, and the cubs were reading that the way they had been built to read it. As evidence that the environment was genuinely dangerous, which meant the appropriate response was to signal their own distress, which made the humans more anxious, which made the cubs more distressed, which made the humans more anxious. What the hold needed was something calm. I am not in any extraordinary sense a calm person. I get frustrated. I worry. I had my own freight of grief from the evacuation. 2 seasons of work abandoned. A colony I had surveyed for 6 years simply gone. Future. I had been building a particular incremental way of someone who is more comfortable with plans than with people. None of that was resolved. None of it was pretended away. But I am by temperament and by profession still. 12 years of soil survey work teaches you how to be in a place without disturbing it. You learn to move through terrain without announcing yourself. You learn to sit in one location for a very long time without the urge to fill the silence. You learn the discipline of waiting without expectation, of observing without projecting, of letting a place simply be what it is while you are in it. You stop being in the way that anxious creatures are always being, always broadcasting, always signaling, always leaking intention into the air around you. You learn to be present in a different register. I sat down approximately 2 meters from the wire enclosure and I was still. Not performing stillness, not doing a relaxation exercise, not holding myself carefully. I simply sat, and I set down whatever I had been carrying internally, the same way I set down my survey pack at the end of a field day. Not because the weight was gone, because there was no purpose in carrying it right now, and the thing I was trying to do required both hands. I did not look at the cubs directly. At a point slightly to the left of the enclosure, the middle distance look of someone who is present but not demanding anything. I waited. 11 minutes. The first cub, the bold one, the one I would later name Sable. Not because she was in black, but because of the particular quality of her attention, was precise and decisive, and had that quality of good sable brushwork, fine-tipped and deliberate. The first cub stopped the chest pulse first, a complete cessation, mid-cycle, as if a switch had been thrown. Then she raised her head from the floor and looked at me. I did not react. I kept looking at my spot on the left of the enclosure. She stood up. She crossed the width of the enclosure to the wire on my side. She pressed her nose to the wire and breathed. The second cub, Ash the careful one, the one who needed a few more minutes of evidence before committing to anything, lifted his head after another 3 minutes and watched his sister. The far corner, he did not move yet. He was still running his assessment. The chest pulse did not razoo me. By midnight, Sable had worked one forepaw through a gap in the wire. Not trying to escape, I understood later. Reaching, the same way. A creature reaches when it has decided that something in the nearby environment is interesting and would benefit from direct investigation, and had her paw resting against the outside of my boot. I did not move. By 1 in the morning, Ash had crossed the enclosure and was lying along the wire on my side, not touching me, his flank against the mesh and his breathing slowed to the deep cycle rhythm of a resting animal. By 2 in the morning, the hold was quieter than it had been seen since we left the Calvin corridor. Dos Peller had been watching from his cot, 6 feet away, with the expression of a man watching something he does not entirely have a category for, came and crouched beside me around 2:30. "What did you do?" he said quietly. "Nothing," I said. "You had to have done something." "I sat still," I said. He looked at Sable's paw against my boot. He looked at Ash's flank against the wire. "They've decided you're safe," he said. "They've decided I'm boring," I said. He almost laughed. It was the first time I had seen anything close to it on his face in 3 days. "Not boring," he said. "Vreth don't calm down for boring. They calm down for," he paused, turning it over, "for whatever you are." The 24 hours passed. At 0600, Commissar O'Doon arrived at Hold 7 to check the distress indicators and found that they had to zero at approximately 0230 and had not risen since. He reviewed the data. He reviewed the enclosure. The cubs now both asleep, curled in a pile that was technically within the wire, except for the fact that Sable's paw was still against my boot because I had not moved, and Ash's head was now resting on top of Sable's flank, in the particular boneless way of a very deeply asleep animal. "This is acceptable for now," O'Doon said. He said it in the tone of a man who has been given a result he did not predict and is not going to let on that it surprises him. He did not look at me as he left. The days that followed settled into a pattern that I would not have predicted and could not have planned. I slept near the enclosure. I sat near the enclosure. I ate near the enclosure. I did not at first go inside it. That was Doss's domain and his professional judgment to manage. But I was simply present. The way you are present with something, when you have decided that its well-being is your concern, without having made a formal announcement about this. Anyone. The cubs chose me anyway, not Doss, though they trusted Doss completely, and he was their keeper. Not the other colonists, though a few of the calmer ones began to sit closer over the following days, drawn by the strange gravity of a quiet corner in an anxious hold. Me, specifically and stubbornly me. Sophists decided this first and prosecuted it with the particular focus of a creature that has made a categorical determination and is simply working out the logistics. By day 5, Sable had memorized my schedule, such as it was on a transit vessel. The ULC consisted of sleep, ration meals, mandatory hygiene rotation, and several hours of nothing in particular. She knew when I woke up. She knew when I came back from the hygiene block. She was at the wire whenever I approached, and at the wire still if I happened to look over from 12 cots away. She had begun making a sound I had not heard before, a low-frequency rumble that was not the chest pulse distress but something different. Something that made Doss stop what he was doing the first time he heard it and look up with an expression I could not read. "What's that?" I asked. "Tracking hum," he said. "It's how they mark something as part of the territory. Part of the pack, technically, but..." He stopped. "What?" "They don't usually do it for non-Vreth," he said. "Outside the pack, it's more of a..." He looked for the word. "It means you're something they're responsible for. Something inside the perimeter." I looked at Sable. Sable looked at me with her flat, browed face and made the sound again. "Is that a problem?" I said. "Depends," Doss said carefully, "on what happens to you." I thought about that for a while. By day 7, Doss had, after considerable internal debate that I watched cross his face without asking about it, the enclosure gate during the quiet hours when most of the hold was asleep, and let the cubs out for what he called supervised movement, went directly to me. Sable put her chin on my knees. Ash circled me twice, pressing his flank against my calf on each pass, in the Vreth way of physically mapping something they have decided belongs to them, and then lay down across my feet with the solidity of an animal that has no intention of moving. I sat very still. They were warm. That surprised me. I had not expected them to feel warm. Though obviously they were warm-blooded and this was not strange, but something about the theoretical fact of it and the actual sensation of it were different. Sable's chin on my knee was warm. Ash across my feet was warm. The tracking hum that both of them were producing was coming through my boots and up into my legs, and it was, I realized, nothing like the distress pulse. It was steady and low, and even. It was the physical equivalent of a house with the lights on. I sat with them for 3 hours while most of the hold slept. That was the night I understood what Doss had meant when he said I was something inside perimeter. I did not feel safe in the abstract, complicated, uncertain way I had been trying to feel safe since Calvin Colony stopped existing. I felt safe in a simpler, older way. The way things are safe when there is something between them and the dark that is bigger than the dark. Commissar O'Doon ordered the enclosure moved to the cargo corridor. It was not, he said, a welfare decision. It was a traffic flow decision. Hold 7's aisle space was consistently impacted during the active hours of the day, and the colonists, who had begun to cluster around it in the quiet hours, because apparently a calm corner of a refugee hold is a resource people will seek out, was contributing to the congestion. Doss came to tell me. He The expression of a man who is trying to figure out how to deliver information he knows is not going to land well. Cargo corridor is C12, he said. It's 3 decks down, no natural light, no ventilation cycle. Temperatures kept at about 4 degrees for the long-term storage sections. Can they be in there, I said. Physically, yes, he said. Cold doesn't bother them. But, he stopped again. Tell me, I said. You won't be able to go down there, he said. C12 is restricted access. Crew and authorized cargo personnel only. Commissar O'Doone has the access lists. I was quiet for a moment. And without me, I said, the chest pulse will come back. Within hours, he said. Probably worse than before. They've consolidated around you now. Separating them from, he looked at me carefully. From their pack anchor, the distress response will be significant, I said. Yes. I stood up. I'd like to speak to Commissar O'Doone, I said. Doss looked at me with something that might have been hope and might have been apprehension, possibly both. The conversation with Commissar O'Doone took place in the narrow secondary office off the main security bay on Deck B, a room that had been designed to hold filing equipment and had been converted, with minimal concession to human comfort, into an administrative space. O'Doone sat behind a desk. I sat in the single chair provided for visitors. The chair was the wrong height and clearly intended to make its occupant feel slightly disadvantaged. I was not, I noticed, particularly disadvantaged. 12 years of field survey had trained me to be comfortable in spaces that were not designed for comfort. The enclosure relocation is a traffic flow decision, O'Doone said, before I had said anything. It is not subject to welfare protocol challenge. I understand that, I said. I'm not challenging it on welfare grounds. I'm raising an operational concern. He waited. The Cubs' distress response will return within hours of separation from the anchor point that's been keeping them stable, I said. That response will transmit through the hull structure to the passenger decks. The disruption you resolved 9 days ago will resume, potentially at a higher intensity. Distressed juvenile Vreth in an isolated cargo corridor will not have less of a distress response than they had in a hold with ambient human contact. They'll have more. The cargo corridor will absorb the vibration, O'Doone said. The cargo corridor is direct hull construction, I said. I checked the ship's layout in the public specification file. There's less insulation between C12 and the passenger decks than between Hold 7 and the passenger decks. You'll hear it more clearly, not less. O'Doone's jaw moved slightly. The solution you are proposing, he said, is for you to have authorized access to a restricted cargo corridor. Temporary authorized access, I said. Locked, supervised during specified hours. Doss Peller is the licensed keeper and would be present at all times. The precedent for civilian keeper liaison access in distressed fauna transit situations exists in the regulation. It's in paragraph 12 of the same document. I read it. There was a long silence. You read the entire fauna transit regulation, O'Doone said. I had time, I said. I still can't sleep through the chest pulse. Something moved across O'Doone's face. It was not amusement. It was something more reluctant than that. The expression of a man arriving, against his will and his preference, at the acknowledgement that the person in the uncomfortable chair has done their homework, and he has not. I'll review paragraph 12, he said. I've printed the relevant section, I said, and put it on his desk. He looked at it. He looked at me. I'll have a decision by 1400, he said. He had a decision by 1300. The access was granted, with conditions. The relocation happened that evening. The enclosure went to C12. Doss went to C12. I went to C12. With my temporary logged access and my field survey jacket I was relieved to discover, warm enough for 4 degrees. The Cubs were not happy about the move. They were unhappy in the particular way of animals who are being relocated against their judgment, not panicking, not displaying aggression, but expressing with every line of their bodies categorical disapproval of the current situation and a readiness to reassess their relationship with anyone responsible for it. Then I walked in. Sable crossed the enclosure in 3 bounds and pressed her face against the wire so hard the mesh dimpled. The tracking hum went immediately from low to full, audible now, not the vibration through the floor but an actual sound, deep and resonant, filling the cargo corridor with something that was not quite a growl and not quite a purr, but something more complete than either. Ash was half a second behind his sister. I sat down on the floor of a cargo corridor in a converted freighter at 4 degrees, cross-legged on bare deck plating, and both cubs pressed themselves against the wire, as close to me as physics permitted. The distress pulse did not start. Doss sat down next to me, wrapped in 2 layers of thermal lining, and said nothing for a while. Tracking hum filled the space between us. "You know," he said finally, "in the field, when a Vreth pack consolidates around a non-pack individual, there's a term for what that individual becomes." "What is it?" I said. "The handlers use still water," he said. "It's not the official species term. That's a Vreth language sound no human can produce. The principle is that the pack orients the same way water orients to the lowest point. Whatever is the stillest thing in the environment, that's where the pack anchors. In the field, if a Vreth pack has decided something is their still water, you will not remove it without removing the pack." I sat with that for a moment. "What does removing the pack look like?" I said. Doss looked at me sideways. "Have you ever seen a Vreth adult at full combat display?" he said. "No," I said. "The cubs are about 30% of adult capacity," he said. "And they're juveniles, so their pack defense responses are still developing. The instinct is the same. If something tries to separate them from their still water forcibly..." He stopped. "That was a long way of saying badly," I said. "Yes," he said. "The incident happened on day 14. We had been in C12 for 5 days. The routine had established itself. Doss in the mornings C, me in the evenings and late nights, the cubs alternating between the energy of juveniles, who needed to move and run and test, their developing strength, and the deep, boneless rest of animals that had decided they were safe. I had learned their individual sounds. I had learned that Sable's flat-browed resting expression was not boredom, but the high alert neutral that Vreth maintained even at rest, that sleeping Vreth was never as asleep as it looked, and that what looked like inattention was often the finest point of the attention, focused through a narrower aperture. I had learned that Ash's caution was not timidity, it was precision. He waited because he was thorough. When he decided something, he decided it completely. I had also learned that the tracking hum, Doss had told me, meant I was inside the perimeter, was not a claim the cubs had made on me. It was a statement they were making about themselves. An announcement to the surrounding environment that whatever I was, they had assessed it and found it acceptable, and were prepared to stand between it and whatever the surrounding environment might produce. I had not asked for that. I had not done anything to earn it, in the way that one earns something, through intention and effort. I had simply been still. It turned out that being still was enough. Commissar O'Doon arrived in C12 on the evening of day 14 with 2 security hands and a printed order. I was in the corridor. Doss was with the cubs. Odin had, I learned later, specifically timed his arrival for an hour, when I was not expected to be there, when my access slot had technically ended, and the next slot was 3 hours away. I was there anyway. I had started staying past my slot because the cubs slept better when I stayed, and I had not formally flagged this to anyone because I had not thought about it as something that needed flagging. This was, in retrospect, naive. Commissar Odin was not a man who failed to notice things, and he had been noticing my extended stays for at least 3 days. I understand now that the timing of his arrival was not an accident. He had waited for a moment when I was technically in violation of my own access terms, which would have removed my standing, to object to anything he did. What he had not factored was that I was already past the enclosure when he came around the corner. Odin had a new order from the ship's commander. Sirhurs. Vethera crossing. Entering a contested transit corridor in 12 hours. Security protocol for contested transit required all non-crew, non-essential personnel to be in their assigned berths in their assigned holds. Cargo corridor C12 was not an assigned berth. Doss Pilar, as a licensed fauna keeper with functional necessity, was being granted an exemption. I was not. He held out the printed order. "You will return to hold 7, deck C," he said, immediately. I was standing in the corridor 6 feet from the enclosure. Sable had been asleep. I know this because I heard the specific change in the quality of the silence from inside the enclosure that I had learned, over the preceding 9 days, meant she had gone from resting to alert. "Commissar," I started. This is not a regulation dispute, Odun said. This is a direct security order under contested transit protocol. It is not subject to paragraph 12 or any other paragraph you have read. You will return to your berth. He took a step forward. I need to stop here and tell you something honest about the next few seconds, because I think it matters. I was not afraid of Commissar Odun. I had not been afraid of him in the security office, and I was not afraid of him now. He was a man who operated through institutional authority, and institutional authority is a real and significant force that I respect. It is not the same thing as a threat. And my nervous system had, by this point, developed a fairly precise vocabulary for the difference between those two things. Odun was not dangerous. He was inconvenient, and he was wrong. And he was about to do something that would cause a problem he did not understand the scale of. That was what made me stay where I was instead of stepping back. The mathematics of the situation were simple. If I retreated, Odun would proceed, and Odun proceeding would be interpreted by the animals in the enclosure as a threat to the perimeter. If I stayed where I was, between Odun and the enclosure, the perimeter was intact and the mathematics were different. I was not being brave. I was being a surveyor. It means being someone who looks at a terrain problem and identifies the line of least disruption. I stayed where I was. Odun took another step. Inside the enclosure, a sound began. It was not the chest pulse. It was not the tracking hum. I do not have a good word for it. The closest I can come is to say that it was the sound of something very large, removing all doubt about what it was. It started below what I could fully hear and rose through registers that were not exactly sound and not exactly vibration, and emerged at a frequency that reached into the chest cavity and tightened something there. It was a sound that communicated, without ambiguity and without elaboration, that the environment had just changed categories. Not a warning. A statement. The way a geological fault is a statement about the land. Not a threat issued, just a fact announcing itself. Both security hands stopped moving. Their hands went, independently, to the latches on their holsters. I watched them do it. I watched the specific sequence, the sound, the body freeze, the hands moving to the weapons, all in approximately 1.5 seconds. The autonomic threat response, running without consultation. I said, quietly, don't. They looked at me. Odin looked at me. If you draw those, I said, in the same quiet voice I used in the enclosure, the situation will change in a way that cannot be changed back. I need you to understand that clearly. The hands stayed on the latches. Nobody drew. Nobody let go either. Commissar Odun did not stop. He was a disciplined man, and discipline is, in some circumstances, its own vulnerability. He took another step. The enclosure gate opened. I want to be precise about this. Das Peller did not open the gate. He was on the far side of the enclosure. He told me later that he had started toward the gate and stopped because he had understood, with the certainty of someone who had worked with Vreth for 6 years, that the gate was going to open regardless of what he did, and that his intervention would make no difference to what happened next, only potentially make it more complicated. What opened the gate was Sable, who had, at some point in the 9 days she had spent in the enclosure, learned the latch. She had learned it the same way she had learned my schedule and mapped my route through the ship, by watching and waiting and storing the information until it was relevant. It was relevant now. Sable came through the gate. She did not run, she walked. She walked the way things walk when they have decided that speed is not necessary, because the outcome is not in question. She walked past me. Not to me. I was not the point right now. I was the thing being walked past on the way to the point. And she placed herself between me and Commissar Odun, and she stood there. At 30% of adult Vreth capacity. 30% of adult Vreth capacity is still, as I now have extremely personal, experiential data to confirm, an animal that is substantially larger than a comfortable distance from a corridor wall. She had grown in 14 days. All the food and the rest and the absence of constant low-grade distress had gone somewhere. And where it had gone was into the length of her legs and the breadth of her shoulders and the particular depth of her chest. And she stood in that corridor and looked at Commissar Odun with the flat, patient gaze of something that has run its assessment and arrived at a conclusion. There was a specific moment. I see it clearly when I think back on it. When Commissar Odun looked at Sable and understood for the first time the actual nature of the situation he had been managing for the past 2 weeks. He had been managing a fauna welfare administrative problem. He had been managing a passenger disruption issue. He had been managing a determined civilian with an inconvenient command of regulatory text. He had not been managing a Vreth pack defense response because he had not known that. What was on the other side of the enclosure wire? He knew it now. I watched him know it, the way you watch a very precise and certain man encounter something that lies outside the precision of what he had been certain about. Ash came through the gate 12 seconds later and positioned himself 2 feet to Sable's right with the precision of a creature that has calculated its placement and found the optimal geometry. They were not side by side. They were offset in the particular formation that Vreth use when they are. Doss explained this to me afterward, in a voice that was somewhat unsteady, coordinating a flanking approach. They were 8 months old. Commissar Odun had stopped. Both security hands had backed against the corridor wall. The hands had come off the holster latches. That I registered as a good sign, I said, in the quietest and most ordinary voice I could produce, which was easier than it might have been, because I was at my core not afraid. Because I had spent 14 days inside the perimeter, and the perimeter was here, in this corridor, and it had just manifested in a way that had removed my fear very effectively. Sable, Ash, easy. The formation did not break. The sound did not stop, but Sable's ear turned slightly toward me. I'm fine, I said, easy. The sound dropped 1 register, not gone, present, and available, and running at the volume of something that had not decided anything yet. Commissar Odun had, I noted with the particular clarity of adrenaline, gone the color of old wax. Commissar, I said very calmly, I would like to suggest that we discuss this order in the security office tomorrow morning. When the transit corridor situation is clearer, there is a provision in contested transit protocol for essential welfare exemptions, and I believe, granted, Odun said. It was not, I will say, finest moment of bureaucratic precision. It was not a formal decision. It was a man communicating, to the best of his ability under the circumstances, that he would very much like the current situation to not continue to be the current situation. I walked forward, past Sable and Ash. They separated to let me pass without being asked, which I understood as a significant thing even in the moment. And I stood in front of Commissar Odun, and I held out my hand for the printed order. He gave it to me. I'll come by the security office at 0900 tomorrow, I said, and we can formalize the exemption. Does that work for you? Yes, he said. He left. The security hands left behind him. I stood in the corridor afterward and noted the slight attached attention of someone whose adrenaline had not fully cleared, that none of the 3 of them had said anything further. No procedural follow-up. No administrative close, they had simply left. Commissar Odun would, I learned later, complete the rest of the Vethara crossing transit without returning to C-12. He would process the exemption paperwork the following morning with complete professional correctness. He would not, in any subsequent document or conversation that I was aware of, reference the events of the evening of day 14. It did not happen, officially. It was a gap in the record, the shape of something that had not gone the way Commissar Odun would have preferred, and which the mechanism of his professionalism had closed over like water over a stone. He was, I will say again, not a bad man. He was a thorough and disciplined man in a difficult position, doing a genuinely hard job on a vessel under stress, and he had made a reasonable administrative decision that had run into something he did not have in his parameters. That happens. I did not hold it against him. I turned around. Sable and Ash were both looking at me. The sound had stopped. The tracking hum had replaced it, steady and low and complete. Doss was standing in the enclosure doorway with an expression that I cannot fully describe, except to say that it combined the residual alarm of someone who has just watched something extremely tense play out at close range with something else, something that looked, on close inspection, like awe. You told them you were fine, he said. I was fine, I said. They were about to. I know, I said, but I was fine. I looked at Sable. I was fine, I said to her this time, her ear tilted. She walked back to me and put her chin on my shoulder, which required her to slightly duck her head, because she had, over 14 days, become substantially taller than I had initially calculated. The tracking hum ran through my bones from her jaw. Ash pressed against my left side, flank mapping me again, confirming I was still the thing he had decided I was. Doss said, after a long moment, "The handlers have a term for what you just did." "Still water discipline?" I said, because I had not forgotten what he'd told me. "No," he said. "Specific act of telling a Vreth pack that you're fine when they're defending you." He paused. "They call it naming the calm. It's the thing that keeps the defense from becoming something else. Only the still water can do it." If anyone else had spoken, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. The formalization of the exemption happened at 0900 the following morning. Sar O'Doon processed it with administrative precision and without any visible acknowledgement that there had been anything unusual about the previous evening. He was a man of systems, and the system now had a provision that had been applied, and that was what the system was for. He signed the paperwork, logged the exemption, and returned to whatever the next item on his desk was. I thanked him. I meant it. He had in the end. When I left the security office, Sable was in the corridor. She had never been outside the cargo level without Doss. She should not technically have been able to access the Deck B corridor. I found out later that she had followed the route I had taken. She knew my route. She had been tracking it since day 5, and had arrived at the corridor outside the security office and had been sitting there, presumably, the duration of my meeting with O'Doon. She fell in beside me as I walked back to the cargo corridor, not behind me, beside me, shoulder height to my shoulder. Her stride adjusted to match mine, her head, at the level where I could have put my hand on it without reaching, if I had wanted to. I did not. I was not ready to do that yet, or she had not told me it was permitted yet. I was not sure which. There was a grammar to it that I was still learning. We walked back to C12 together. Doss was at the enclosure entrance. He looked at Sable, who had apparently left the cargo level, through a route he had not anticipated being accessible, and then at me. "I'm going to need to reinforce some things," he said. "She followed my route," I said. "I know," he said. He shook his head, not in frustration, in something that looked more like a man recategorizing something in real time. "She mapped it. She knows every access point between here and wherever you go. If she thought you were in danger." "I know," I said. "The whole corridor," he said. "The whole ship, maybe." I looked at Sable. She was looking at me with her flat-browed gaze, precise attention that looked like neutrality and was not. "She's 8 months old," I said. "Yes," Doss said. "And she has decided that everything between her and you is inside the perimeter." He paused. "That doesn't get smaller when she gets bigger." I thought about that. I thought about a colony that no longer existed, and a future that had needed rebuilding, and a hold full of displaced people who had been afraid, because they had very reasonable things to be afraid of. Thought about the tracking hum in my bones, and ash across my feet in 4-degree cold, and the warmth of Sable's chin on my knee. "No," I said. "I don't suppose it does." We arrived at the outer threshold processing stations on day 22. 912 colonists, 2 Vreth juveniles, 1 licensed keeper, 1 temporary welfare exemption holder. The processing intake forms had a field for party composition. Stood at the counter and looked at it for a moment. Behind me, Sable made the tracking hum. I filled in the field. Doss, reading over my shoulder, said nothing for a moment. "You put them down as dependents," he said. "The form had a field for it," I said. He was quiet. "The intake officer is going to have questions," he said. "Probably," I said. "The Vreth registration system requires licensed keeper documentation for." "I know," I said. "I read the registration regulation last night." Doss looked at me. After 6 years of working with Vreth, he was not, I thought, a man easily surprised by what apex predators decided to do. Somewhat more surprised by what people decided to do. "You're not a handler," he said. "No," I said. "I'm a soil surveyor." I handed the form to the intake officer. "But they've decided differently, and I thought I should at least be honest about it on the paperwork." The intake officer looked at the form. He looked at Sable, who was visible through the processing bay window, sitting in the designated fauna waiting area with her chin on her forepaws, and her eyes tracking every movement in the room between her and me with flat, precise attention of an animal for whom the concept of a wall as a boundary between inside and outside was largely theoretical. He looked at Ash, who was pressed against the window glass on the outside, forepaw flat against the surface, in the particular posture of a creature who has decided that if the window is the thinnest point between him and his still water, the window is where he belongs. The intake officer stamped the form. There were, in the end, no questions. The handlers at the outer threshold station, the ones who processed incoming fauna with the particular combination of competence and wariness that the job required, pulled Doss aside on day 2 of our processing stay. They had a term, he told me later, for what had happened aboard the Vithara crossing. Not the distress pulse mitigation, not the cargo corridor exemption, not even the corridor incident, though that had made it into the transit report and was going to be discussed in at least 3 separate regulatory review meetings over the following year. The term was for what I had become to Sable and Ash. They called it, Doss said, in the shorthand that field handlers used, the practical vocabulary of people who had seen enough to need words for things the official documentation had not caught up with. They called it still water discipline. The formal behavior assessment note in the Cubs file, filed by the senior Vreth handler at the station, after she had spent 4 hours observing their responses in the processing pen, and had tried twice, unsuccessfully, to redirect their attention using standard calibration protocols, read as follows. Juvenile Vreth subjects, Sable designate, Ash designate, demonstrate full pack consolidation around civilian anchor, MOS non-Heller. Subjects exhibit still water discipline orientation at highest observed intensity for non-Heller category. Standard separation protocols are not recommended without anchor present. Handler recommendation. Do not attempt relocation without OS. See attached incident report Contested transit encounter. Note. Anchor subject maintains optimal distress neutralizing signature without training. Prior fauna experience. Classification. Natural still water. Reclassification review recommended. I read this note 3 days later when Doss showed it to me. I read the last line twice. Natural still water. I had not asked for it. I had not done anything extraordinary. I had sat next to an enclosure in a converted cargo hold in the middle of the night, and been still because being still was the only thing I knew how to be. And 2 creatures that should have been afraid had decided, on the basis of that stillness, that I was the thing they needed. I sat with that for a while. Sable's chin came to rest on my knee. She had to fold herself considerably to do this now, being substantially larger than she had been on the day she first managed it, but she did it anyway, with the determination of an animal that has decided that some gestures are not size-dependent. The tracking hump started. Ash settled across my feet with the same solidity he always had, boneless and absolute. I put my hand on Sable's head. It was the first time. I had been waiting for the right moment, and had not known what the right moment would feel like until it arrived. And it felt like this. Warm, and certain, and like the kind of weight that is not a burden at all. She did not move. The tracking hum deepened. Outside the processing pen window, the outer threshold station moved through its ordinary business, ships coming and going. 910 colonists beginning the complicated process of rebuilding lives from what they had carried out of Calvin Colony, the future opening in the slow and incremental way that futures open when you have no other option but to let them. I was, in all the ways I could account for, unremarkable. The Vreth apparently had not been consulted. End. Challenge. Author's note on still water discipline. The term, as used by Vreth field handlers, refers to the behavioral state of a non-pack individual that a Vreth pack has designated as a pack anchor. Specifically, quality of low alarm signature presence that triggers pack consolidation and neutralizes distress response in juvenile subjects. No training protocol reliably produces it. It occurs per field observation in approximately 1 in 2,000 non-Heller contacts with distressed juvenile Vreth. It has no prerequisite. It is not strength, dominance, or displayed calm. It is, as closely as the handlers can define it, being genuinely, thoroughly, and without performance, exactly where you are.